Hey, sixth graders. This is kind of the last day that I'll be doing things like this because the rest of the time will be pretty much starting with Zoom. I mean, there will still be videos, but this one's different because I'm preparing this for B and C while A is in front of me. I will continue on. Today, I got to change this. Is actually Thursday, November 5th. So anyway, we're going to continue Seed, folks. We're going to read 3 chapters today. So I'm going to bust a move. Remember as we go, read along with me. It's really important. So I gave you the 3 chapters. I'll stop in between them, or you can stop the video. I do have some pre-writing, again, reminding you so that writing about your thinking is really important. That's how you remember stuff. I checked the scores for the character matching, and we did okay. You guys can do better. I think wonder if when you're home you're still not doing the work, or you're not doing it well enough, you're not concentrating enough. We're going to finish this today, and I will go through it in class. But basically, this is the really important work, and we probably will go through it maybe next week when we're together. But I just look for answers, not right answers. I want you to think about it and put something in there. And then we'll go through the map. And if you think about the map, here's what we got. Look at that. It's growing. We've got every continent. We're missing some Africa, and we're missing South America and Australia. But we definitely have across the way here, we've got a lot of ground covered. This is one neighborhood. This is all represented in that neighborhood. That's what's really cool about this book. We'll see what we read today. All right, here we go. So first chapter is Maricela. I'm not sure how she says it, but that's how I might say it. Looks young. If you're Mexican, the Cubans and Puerto Ricans hate you because they think you snuck in illegally and they didn't, which they would have if they could have walked. If you're a teenager, the whole world hates you. If you're a pregnant teenager, people think you should be burned at the stake. I'm a Mexican pregnant 16-year-old, so shoot me and get it over with. I wouldn't actually care if you did. In a way, I'm already dead. I used to be really, really hot. Because of the baby, I'm as fat as a wrestler. I dropped out. I've been to exactly 0 parties, and I've been asked out exactly 0 times, including by the scum who got me pregnant. My parents were mad. They wanted me to graduate, but abortion or adoption, forget it. Then they got sort of excited about it. They both love little babies. Not me. They started praying for it every night while I was begging my body to miscarry. I don't know if you guys know what miscarry is, but it's when the body naturally can't carry a child, and so it's early usually, and it sort of just flushes the system. It's pretty emotional experience for a woman and a partner. So it's interesting that she's begging for it. This kind of shows her age. She's really young. She doesn't quite understand how this stuff is really emotionally powerful. 3 of us from my high school got into this program for pregnant teens. They give you rides to the doctor and help with getting your GED at home. GED, which is basically the degree that takes the place of your high school diploma. General Ed degree is called. Great, except that Penny, the woman who we see, saw the community garden and got the program its own spot to give us practice taking care of something and to let us witness the miracle of life, and to try to keep us from eating our babies alive or dropping them in dumpsters. She's kidding. It was already the middle of summer, so she had us plant radishes since they grow fast. All 3 of us hate radishes. As soon as the little green leaves came up, a gopher or something wiped them out. So much for the miracle of life. I didn't tell Penny I was hoping the same thing happened to my baby. She's so cheerful I never could. She's not puking or getting as big as a blimp. No wonder she's always smiling. After the radishes came squash, then Swiss chard, which nobody knew how to eat. I was in my 7th month, so she's pretty big. I hated the bending. We all complained, but Penny just smiled. The rest of us called working there the chain gang. I hated the feel of dirt under my nails. One afternoon, Yolanda broke 2 of her fancy, painted, expensive nails and cursed out loud for 10 minutes. Penny couldn't shut her up. Then another woman came over and gave us this long lecture about the word decorum. Think about this. A person came over and gave them a speech about decorum. Sounds like a teacher, right? I couldn't believe my eyes. It was my old 3rd grade teacher, Miss Fleck. There's a character that came back. I prayed she wouldn't recognize me, but naturally she did and asked me all the usual questions. I should have had the answers printed up on a card to hand out. The next week, when some man threw a can out his window, which landed about a foot from my head, Miss Fleck figured out what apartment he was in, walked up, and yelled at him like he was a kid. She treated the whole world like her classroom. Different people came to our part of the garden for different reasons. The Puerto Rican kid had these pumpkin plants that kept getting into ours. Who's that? Pumpkins. Which gave him an excuse to walk right past me and talk to Dolores, who was 15 and pretty and still didn't look pregnant. I couldn't wait for her to get huge. Sometimes this black guy ran through our garden. He couldn't take time to go around. He grew lettuce, or tried to. Most of it was dead. He'd drive up in a cab, slam on the brakes like the Pope just stepped in front of him, run through our squash, cut a bunch of lettuce, and run back with it in a bucket of water. Then he'd peel out, leaving lots of rubber. Then there were the people who came by to give us different things. Vegetables that they'd grown and thought we should eat, which we always gave away later. Advice on growing our stupid Swiss chard. Advice on giving birth and raising kids, which I tuned out as soon as they started. One day in August, it was just me and Penny. This black woman, Leona, who had a garden and talked to us, came over and gave me some flowers she'd grown. They were yellow. She called them goldenrod and said if I'd made them into a tea, it would help me with the delivery. She knew I didn't want to be pregnant. I could talk to her about it. That day was almost too humid to talk. The windows around the garden were open and you could hear 10 different TVs and radios. A storm was coming. The thunder was getting closer. And then it hit. Bam! And all the TVs and radios went off. So did the lights. It was a power failure. It was quiet in the garden without the noise. So quiet, it was weird. I looked around. An old man near us was slowly picking cucumbers like nothing had happened. An old man. Whole city shuts down, but the garden just keeps going, Leona said. She talked on how plants don't run on electricity or clock time, how none of nature did, how nature ran on sunlight and rain and the seasons, and how I was part of that system. The words sort of put me into a daze. My body was part of nature. I was related to bears, to dinosaurs, to plants, to things that were 1,000,000 years old. It hit me that this system was much older and stronger than the other. She said how it wasn't some disgrace to be a part of it. She said it was an honor. I stared at the squash plants. It was a world in there. It seemed like I could actually see the leaves and flowers growing and changing. I was in that weird daze, and for just that minute, I stopped wishing my baby would die. Okay, next one is Amir. That's Amir. Okay. Looks like he's growing eggplant. In India, we have many vast cities, just as in America. There, too, you are one among millions. But there, at least, you know your neighbors. Here, one cannot say that. The object in America is to avoid contact, to treat all as foes unless they're known to be friends. Here, you have 1,000,000 crabs living in 1,000,000 crevices. God, doesn't that sound like totally appropriate after a huge election? When I saw the garden for the first time, so green among the dark brick buildings, I thought back to my parents' Persian rug. It showed climbing vines, rivers and waterfalls, grapes, flower beds, singing birds, everything a desert dweller might dream of. Those rugs were indeed portable gardens. In the summers in Delhi, so very hot, my sisters and I would lie upon it and try to press ourselves into its world. The garden's green was as soothing to the eye as the deep blue of that rug. I'm aware of color. I manage a fabric store, but the garment's greatest benefit, I feel, was not relief to the eyes, but to make the eyes see our neighbors. I grew eggplants, onions, carrots, and cauliflower. When the eggplants appeared in August, they were pale purple, a strange and eerie shade. When my wife would bring our little son, he was forever wanting to pick them. There was nothing else in the garden with that color. Very many people came over to ask about them and talk to me. I recognized a few from the neighborhood. Not one had spoken to me before. And now how friendly they turned out to be. The eggplants gave them an excuse for breaking the rules and starting a conversation. God, that's like Minnesota. Moving here, no one wants to talk. How happy they seem to have found this excuse to let their natural friendliness out. Those conversations tied us together. In the middle of summer, someone dumped a load of tires on the garden at night as if it were still filled with trash. A man's 4 rows of young corn were crushed. In an hour, we all had the tires by the curb. We were used to helping each other by then. A few weeks later, early in the evening, a woman screamed down the block from the garden. A man with a knife had taken her purse. 3 men from the garden ran after him. I was surprised that I was one of them. Even more surprising, we caught him. Royce, remember him? Guy with Curtis? Held the man to a wall with his pitchfork until the police arrived. I asked the others. Not one of us had ever chased a criminal before, and most likely we wouldn't have, except near the garden. There, you felt part of the community. I came to the United States in 1980. Cleveland is a city of immigrants. The Poles are especially well known here. I'd always heard that the Polish men were tough steelworkers and that the women cooked lots of cabbage, but I'd never known one until the garden. She was an old woman whose space bordered mine. She had a 7-block walk to the garden, the same route I took. We spoke quite often. We both planted carrots. When her hundreds of seedlings came up in a row, I was very surprised that she did not thin them, pulling out all but one healthy-looking plant each few inches to give them room to grow. I asked her. She looked down at them and said she knew she ought to do it, but that this task reminded her too closely of concentration camp, where the prisoners were inspected each morning and divided into 2 lines, the healthy to live and the others to die. Her father, an orchestra violinist, had spoken out against the Germans, which had caused her family's arrest. When I heard her words, I realized how useless was all that I had heard about Poles, how much richness it hid, like the worthless shell around an almond. I still do not know or care whether she cooks cabbage. The garden found this out with Royce. He was young and black. He looked rather dangerous. People watched him and seemed to be relieved when he left the garden. Then he began spending more time there. We found out that he had a stutter, that he had 2 sisters, that he liked the cats that roamed through the garden, and that he worked very well with his hands. Soon all the mothers were trying to feed him. How very strange it was to watch people who would have crossed the street if they'd seen him coming a few weeks before, now giving him vegetables, more than he could eat. In return, he'd watered for people who were sick and fixed fences and made other repairs. He might weed your garden or use the bricks from the building that was torn down from up the block to make you a brick path between your rows. He always pretended that he hadn't done it. It was always a surprise. He felt honored to be chosen. He was trusted and liked and famous after his exploit with the pitchfork. Remember the story about, chasing the guy? He was not a black teenage boy. He was Royce. In September, he and a Mexican man collected many bricks from up the street and built a big barbecue. I was in the garden on Saturday when the Mexican family drove up in a truck with a dead pig on the back. They built a fire, put a heavy metal spit through the pig, a spit's like a big steel rod, and began to roast it. A bit later, their friends began arriving. One brought a guitar, another played violin. They filled the folding table with food. Perhaps it was one of their birthdays, or perhaps no reason was needed for the party. It was beautiful weather, sunny but not hot. Fall was just beginning, and the garden was changing from green to brown. Those of us who had come to work felt the party's spirit enter us. The smell of the roasting pig drifted out and called to everyone, gardeners or not. Soon the entire garden was filled. It was a harvest festival like those in India, though no one had planned it to be. People brought food and drinks in drums. I went home to get my wife and son. Watermelons from the garden were sliced open. The gardeners proudly showed off what they had grown. We traded harvests, as we often did, and we gave food away, as we often did also. Even I, a businessman trained to give away nothing, to always make a profit. The garden provided many excuses for breaking that particular rule. Many people spoke to me that day. Several asked where I was from. I wondered if they knew as little about Indians as I had known about Poles. One old woman, Italian I believe, said she'd admired my eggplants for weeks and told me how happy she was to meet me. She praised them and told me how to cook them and asked all about my family. But something bothered me. Then I remembered a year before, she'd claimed that she'd received the wrong change in my store. I was called out to the register. She'd gotten quite angry and called me, despite her own accent, a dirty foreigner. Now that we were so friendly with each other, I dared to remind her of this. Her eyes became huge. She apologized to me over and over again. She kept saying, "Back then, I didn't know it was you." All righty, last one. This is Florence. Think about that last moment, right? Amir was just like this moment between this woman. She was able to call him a dirty foreigner when she didn't know him. Then she learned who he was, and she felt bad. That's all it takes. Maybe that's what we need more of. All right, here's Florence. My great-grandparents walked all the way from Louisiana to Colorado. That was in 1859. They were both freed slaves, and they wanted to get food and far from cotton-growing country. They went over the mountains just to be safe and homesteaded along the Gunnison River. which is how my grandfather and my father and my sisters and I all came to be born there. They're the first black family in the whole country. My father called them our seed folks because they were the first of our family there. I think of them when I see any of the people who started the garden on Gibb Street. They're seed folks too. I'm talking about that first year before there were spigots and hoses and the tool shed and new soil, and before the landlord started charging more for apartments that look on the garden. Whoa, we've jumped way in the future here. Think about that. She just said she was talking about this time, and she's talking about before there was spigots. So it means there's hoses and there's running water and a tool shed. Holy cow, it's developed entirely differently. So we've jumped a major amount of time forward. I would have been in on the garden for sure if it weren't for the arthritis in my hands. Growing up out in the country, I still miss country things. My husband's from here. He doesn't know about the smell of a hayfield and eating beans off the vine instead of from the store. I had to settle for being a watcher. I wasn't the only one. I see others on the fire escapes or standing on the sidewalk like me. One day I looked up and saw a head in the window moving forward and back. It was a man who'd pulled up his rocking chair. He was watching the gardeners like TV. My grandmother's sampler from when she was a girl said, "Be not solitary, be not idle." A sampler is like a book that they carry around. Kids would bring them around like your notebooks. Being retired, it's harder. So I try to take a walk every day, which is how I found the garden to begin with. I'd always stop there to see what was new. I was just a watcher, but I was proud of the garden as if it were mine, proud and protective. I remember how mad I got when I saw a man reach through someone's fence by the sidewalk and try to grab a tomato. Who grows tomatoes? I said, "How dare you?" He pulled back his hand and said he'd heard it was a community garden. It's sad every fall seeing it turn brown, fewer and fewer people there. That very first year was the hardest. It had been such a wonderful change to see people making something for themselves instead of waiting for a welfare check, to see a part of the neighborhood looking better every day, and to smell those good smells of growing plants. The green drained away, then the frost hit. You'd pass and hear those dry corn stalks shaking in the wind as if they were shivering. The pumpkins were about the only color left. And then the boys sold them all. Some people cut up their old plants with clippers and dug them back into the soil. A few covered their ground with leaves, but once that job was done, it was done. By November, the cats were the only ones there. That winter was a cold one, cold as Colorado. You'd walk by the garden covered with snow, just the fence tops sticking out, and you try to remember it back in July. Someone stuck a Christmas tree there in December. It stayed up until March. It's hard to tell one month from another that time of year. It's all just winter. Because of the weather, I missed lots of walks. When I did get out, I couldn't go past the garden without slowing down to look, even though there was nothing growing. Sometimes there'd be one of the gardeners there just looking too. You can't see Canada across Lake Erie, but you know it's there. It's the same with spring. You have to have faith, especially in Cleveland. Snow in April always breaks your heart. I think we all had 2 April snows that year. Waiting for the snow to melt was like waiting for a glacier to move. Finally, it was gone for good. The ground was back, and last year's leaves like a bookmark showing where you'd left off. It was a joy to get out again. Just to walk without wearing a heavy coat and boots felt like flying. We all know how that feels, right? But the garden was still empty. I was disappointed. I suppose it was still too early to plant. I began to wonder if anyone would come. Maybe no one was interested. Or maybe the city had shut it down or sold the lot. I was worried. Then one day I passed it, and someone was digging. It was a little Oriental girl with a trowel and a plastic bag of lima beans. I didn't recognize her. It didn't matter. I felt as happy inside as if I'd just seen the first swallow of spring. Then I looked up. There was the man in the rocker. We waved and waved to each other. There you go. Kim starts it, and maybe she ends it. She uses the word Oriental, which, just have to say, would not be a word you would use. It's an old word that someone who doesn't know that that word isn't acceptable anymore still use, but it's not acceptable. It's not a word you would use. So there we go, people. We'll talk about this when we get together, but there's our book. So hopefully you enjoyed it. It's got a lot of cool moments where you can see characters come back. And let's fill out your character sheet for Maricela, Amir, and Florence. And then let's fill that out, and you are done. And I will see you on the 11th. All right, take care.